Hello, and welcome to the 2500 series video. I'm Jordan Rudess. The purpose of this video is to give you a basic overview of your new instrument and get you up and running quickly. We'll cover some basic programming tips, create a sequence, and look at all the major operational areas. This video is not intended to be a substitute for your manual. In fact, you may find it helpful to pause this video and refer to your manual as you watch. You'll also find it helpful to watch the video while you're sitting next to your 2500, so you can follow along on your own instrument. This video has been broken up into sections. To help you find these various sections, a number will be displayed in the upper left-hand corner, so you can fast forward to the areas that most interest you. These numbers correspond with the chapter titles printed on the video box. Don't be afraid to push any buttons on the instrument. You can't break anything. Let's get started. First, we'll give you a quick overview of the instrument. Looking at the front panel, you'll notice that it's divided into sections. On the left and along the bottom is a row of 8 buttons. Pressing these buttons takes you to the 2500's 8 operational modes. The names of the modes are printed in white under the display. Underneath this, you'll notice that the buttons also have a green label, and some of the buttons have a yellow label. While you're editing a program and are in the program editor, then the green labels apply to these buttons. We'll be showing some examples of this later. When you're editing a sample within the sample editor, the yellow labels apply. Above these buttons is another row of 8 buttons. The edit and exit buttons are used to enter and exit the various editors found in the different modes. The middle 6 buttons are called soft buttons because their function changes according to where you are in the software menus. You will notice 6 blocks at the bottom of the display. The blocks change names in relation to the function displayed on the screen. For instance, when you first turn on the 2500, you're in the program mode, and the soft buttons are used to transpose by octave, change MIDI channels, and change the way programs are displayed, or send a MIDI all notes off message. If you have a rack version of the 2500 and just tried pressing these buttons, you may have noticed that pressing the octave plus and minus buttons had no effect. Don't worry, this is normal. We'll explain about this in just a moment. To the left of the display are the channel bank buttons. These buttons also have different functions depending on which mode you're in. In program and several other modes, they will switch you through the 16 MIDI channels. In quick access mode, they switch to the different quick access banks. In the song mode, they switch record tracks. And if you're editing programs or setups, then the green label under the button applies, switching you through layers in a program or zones in a setup. To the right of the display are buttons used for navigating and data entry. The 4 arrow buttons move the cursor around in the various edit screens and also scroll through programs and setups when in those modes. The wheel and the plus and minus buttons are used to scroll through the values of the various parameters, and the numeric keypad is used to directly enter specific values. Finally, we come to the sample input section. If you don't have the sampling option, there will be a blank panel instead of jacks. We will not be covering sampling in this video, so refer to the chapter on sampling in your manual for information on this. On the back panel, you'll find the typical power, MIDI, SCSI, and audio connections, along with the KDS port, which is used to connect the optional DMT interface using Kurzweil's proprietary digital format. If you have the sampling option, you will also see digital input and output connectors. Let's take a moment to talk about the audio outs. You'll see there are 10 configured as pairs labeled mix, A, B, C, and D. It's important to understand that even though there are 10 jacks, there are only 8 routable outs. Here's the way it works. When you route a signal, you choose the A, B, C, or D pairs and the appropriate panning position. But all audio signals come out of the mix pair until you physically plug a cable into a separate out. At that point, any signal routed to that out is removed from the mix and comes out of that particular output. So if you plug cables into all of the separate outs, there will be no signal coming from the mix outs. To route something through the standard effects processor in your 2500, you need to set the output to A, but the effects actually only come out of the mix outs. So if you plug cables into the A outs, then you will not be able to use the effects. For this reason, a typical way that the users would wire their units is to plug into the mix, B, C, and D pair. We should mention that this method of using the effects applies only to the standard effects processor. If you add the KD effects option, you can route effects to any output. The separate outs can also be used as insert points for external instruments, or to route a 2500 signal to an external effects processor and back into the instrument. For more on this, please consult your manual. When you first turn your unit on, you may want to change the display contrast. There are two ways to do this. The first way is to hold down the Enter button. While holding it down, move the wheel. This method is temporary. Your 2500 will revert to its previous setting the next time you power up. The second method is to go to the master mode and use the cursor buttons to bring you to where it says contrast, and move the wheel once again. As you scroll it, you'll see the contrast changing. Now let's jump in and start playing. We'll assume you know how to hook up MIDI and audio. If you aren't in program mode, go there by pressing the program button. If you have a rack, make sure your keyboard is transmitting on channel 1. Then check the upper right-hand corner of the 2500's display to see that it's on channel 1. If not, you can change it using the channel bank buttons or the channel soft buttons. To scroll through different programs, you can use the wheel, the arrow buttons, or the plus and minus soft buttons. You can also call up a specific program by typing its number and pressing Enter. Take some time to explore the preset programs, making sure to use the mod wheel and other control sources. For those of you who have a rack, if your keyboard has a data slider, make sure it is set to controller number 6 and explore what happens to the sound when you move it. On most of the preset programs, moving the mod wheel and data slider and using aftertouch will change the sound in subtle or dramatic ways, giving you some idea of the power of vast synthesis. A complete list of the preset programs and how control sources affect them is printed in the reference section of the manual. You can use the View soft button to switch the display between a big view and a regular view.
Jordan has already showed you can turn the wheel or enter a number specifically, but you may want to just go bank by bank, and the quick way to do that is to press the increment-decrement buttons right under the alpha wheel, like so. By pressing the increment and decrement buttons simultaneously, we'll advance by 100. Right now we're in program mode, so we go from program 1 to program 100. Another press of both of these buttons takes us to 200, the first user-created program. Again, by double pressing these buttons, you'll cycle through any banks that have programs in them. This also works for setup mode. If I were to select setups, I can also scroll by increments of 100, just by pressing the increment-decrement button simultaneously.
The 2500 is 16-part multi-timbral. That means you can have a different program on each channel. You can see what program is on each channel by using the channel bank buttons or the channel soft buttons. You can easily call up a specific program for a MIDI channel by going to that channel and picking a program that you want. If you have the rack, keep in mind that you may be looking at channel 2, but if you are sending from your keyboard on channel 1, you will still hear the program that is on channel 1. As you scroll through different programs on various MIDI channels, you may occasionally see a program that is in parenthesis, and that will not make any sound. This is because you have selected what Kurzweil calls a drum program. Normal programs in the 2500 can contain up to 3 layers, but you can actually have programs with as many as 32 layers. Programs that are more than 3 layers are called drum programs. In fact, they do not have to have drum sounds assigned to them. They can have any sound. But we use the name drum program because we feel it's the most likely use for a program with 32 layers. The only limitation for a drum program is that it must be played in a MIDI channel which has been designated as a drum channel. A drum channel can play any program. It does not have to play a drum program, but a drum program must be played in a drum channel. You can have up to 8 drum channels on the 2500. Under default conditions, channels 1 through 8 are drum channels, but you can change this to be channels 1 through 7, plus the channel of your choice. To set that channel, go to the master page. You will see a parameter marked drum channel. Set this to any value between 9 and 16.
There are many ways to use your 2500 in live performance mode, and thanks to the very handy buttons on the front panel, you can do an awful lot. I'm going to use the MIDI channel buttons to scroll through a variety of programs on different MIDI channels and layer them in real time, and also use the octave shift keys to allow me to do some fancy arpeggios very quickly, playing in the same range of the keyboard. Switching to MIDI channel 1 and using a piano, changing its octave, and to 0 back to normal tuning, I just press both octave keys. Changing to MIDI channel 2 for more orchestra. Changing to MIDI channel 3 for some wind. Pressing both channel buttons to return back to MIDI channel 1 to play piano again. Changing my octave and zeroing back to normal tuning. So these are some very simple uses of the front panel buttons that allow a lot of creativity to happen on the fly.
Let's create a simple program. Go back to the program mode and call up program 199, the default program. Press Edit to enter the program editor. Whenever you enter the program editor, you start out on the algorithm page. We'll talk more about the algorithms later. Notice that the 2 outside soft buttons say More. This is because there are many different pages in the program editor. By using the More buttons, you can cycle through different groups of soft buttons. For now, we'll stay with the first group of soft buttons and press Key Map. On this page, you'll select the key map, which will be the basic sound for this layer. Select key map number 4, the soft electric piano. So far, we have a 1-layer program. Notice that the display says layer 1 of 1 in the upper right-hand corner. Let's create a second layer. Press the left More button once. Now press the soft button that says New Layer. The 2500 creates a second layer set to the same key map as layer 1. Notice that the display now says 2 of 2 in the upper right-hand corner. Let's change the key map for layer 2 to number 3, hard electric piano. Now if you play, you'll hear both samples together. To switch between layers, use the channel bank buttons to the left of the display. You can mute individual layers while you're editing. Notice that the program, setup, and quick access buttons are marked Mute 1, 2, and 3 in green. Pressing any one of these will mute that layer. In the case of programs which are more than 3 layers, then the Mute 1 button will solo the currently displayed layer, and the Mute 2 or 3 buttons will mute the currently displayed layer. Now press the right More button, and then press the Layer Soft button. This page contains some basic parameters that affect how the layer works. We are going to set things so that the program switches between the 2 layers with velocity. If you are not already on layer 1, switch it there with the channel bank button. The low velocity parameter is already set to triple P. Use the down arrow button to move the cursor to high velocity and change the value to MF. Now switch to the second layer. Leave the high velocity on triple forte and change the low velocity to F. Now by striking a key with different amounts of velocity, you can switch between the two layers. Notice that there are also other parameters for note range on this page. You can use these to create split programs by limiting the note range for each layer. There are many other things we could change, but we'll have to save that for the advanced programming section. For now, let's talk about naming and saving your program. Press the left More button twice, then press Name. You see the name of the original program, Default Program. Let's name our program E-Piano. The numeric keypad is used for naming. Each number has letters printed in green underneath the button. Each time you press the button, it cycles through those letters. Use the plus/minus button to change from upper to lower case. The left and right arrow buttons, along with the two arrow soft buttons, are used to move the cursor across the screen. You can use the delete buttons to erase characters, and insert will insert a space. Once you have named the program, press OK. Now press Save. The 2500 will choose the first blank number to save into. You can actually choose any number you want to save into. If a program already exists in the number you choose, the display changes to show the program in that location and asks you if you want to replace it. For now, let's just save it to a blank location. You have just created your first program. Press Exit to leave the program editor.
Since you can have up to 1,000 programs in memory, or for that matter setups, a very handy feature is included called Search String, which allows you to look up any of the programs or any of the setups just simply by pressing the Enter button and one of the 10 numeric keypad buttons. I can then type in a series of letters. In this case, I've typed in the word rock. When I say OK, it will find only those programs using the word rock. So now I can hold Enter and either hit the increment or decrement button, and that will scroll forwards or backwards through only those objects with the word rock in it. So I'll scroll just a few times, and the program I was looking for is right here, Rock Band.
Now let's take a look at setup mode. Setup mode allows you to take up to 3 programs on 3 different MIDI channels and split or layer them in zones across the keyboard. If you go to setup mode, you will notice that you can have up to 3 different programs. Each zone will be on a different MIDI channel. Lines under the program name show where each zone is laid out on the keyboard. Before we proceed any further, we need to talk about one parameter which will be important if you have the rack module. It's called the local keyboard channel, and it is found on the MIDI receive page. To get to it, press the MIDI mode button, then the soft button labeled receive. You will need to use this parameter if you want to use setup mode. It's important to understand that a setup is a control-oriented function. On the keyboard version of the 2500, the keyboard itself will transmit on up to 3 channels when in setup mode. But with the rack, if your keyboard only sends information on one MIDI channel, you need a way to turn that information on one MIDI channel into 3 channels. This is what the local keyboard channel parameter does. It takes the signal coming in one channel and turns it into different information depending on where you are in the 2500. To demonstrate, set local keyboard channel to 1 and then send from your keyboard on channel 1. Now go back to setup mode and notice that although all the zones within your setups are on different MIDI channels, they all respond to information coming in on one channel. It is important to understand that local keyboard channel will change the way the 2500 performs in other modes as well. It changes the incoming information depending on what you have displayed in the 2500. For instance, if you are in program mode with channel 5 in the display, then the information coming in on channel 1 will be turned into channel 5, and you will hear the program assigned to channel 5. But if you turn local keyboard channel off by setting it to none, then if you send on channel 1, you will hear the program that is assigned to channel 1, even if you are looking at channel 5. Local keyboard does more than just change the MIDI channel. You will notice that the octave plus and minus soft buttons now will transpose the information. And you can even use it to change one type of MIDI controller to another. For more information on this, please consult your manual. Now let's go back to setup mode. Take some time to play the preset setups. Once again, make sure to try using the mod wheel and other controllers to see how they affect the sound. Let's make our own setup. It's easy to do. As we mentioned before, a setup can have up to 3 zones. We're going to make a setup with 2 programs layered on the right side of the keyboard and another program on the left side. Go to Setup 100, the basic setup. Now press Edit. I'm going to be using some programs that I've loaded in. You can use any program you'd like. I'm using E-Piano for the first zone. Notice it's assigned to channel 1. The most important thing to remember about setups is that each zone must be on a separate channel, because you can only have one program on a channel at a time. The exception to this would be if you wanted the same program in more than one zone. For example, you could take a program and assign it to 2 zones, but then transpose one zone an octave up, allowing you to play 2 octaves of the same sound. But more often than not, you'll be using different programs for each zone. Now we're going to limit this zone to the top half of the keyboard. You can set the low note and high note individually by changing the parameters on the page. But the easy way is to press the soft button that says Set Range, then just strike the 2 notes on your keyboard. Now go to the second zone by pressing the Channel Bank Up button. Notice the display says Zone 2 in the upper right-hand corner, and that the channel is now set to 2. For this zone, I'm selecting Meditation Pad. Set it to the same key range as Zone 1. Let's transpose this program down an octave. Move the cursor down to the transpose parameter and set it to -12 semitones. Let's make this program a little softer than the first one. The parameter marked V in the bottom right-hand corner lets you set an initial volume for a zone. It does this by sending MIDI volume control on that channel. Let's set it to 95 for this zone. Finally, go to Zone 3. Move the cursor back to Program. For this zone, I'm selecting Warm Bass. Now assign this to the lower half of the keyboard. Just like in the program editor, you can use the 3 mute buttons to temporarily mute a zone while you are in the editor. The last step is to pick an effect for our setup. We'll choose Medium Hall. If you want, you can adjust the wet-dry mix. Remember that the effect in the wet-dry mix will be the same for all the zones. If you want, you can name and save your setup. The procedure is the same as with a program. Like programs, there are 1,000 locations for setups. Now we'll take a look at Quick Access Mode. This mode was designed especially for performance purposes, but it can also be useful in the studio. When you go to Quick Access Mode, you will notice a list of 10 names. These can either be names of programs or setups. Notice that they are laid out in the same way the numeric keypad is laid out. By pressing a button on the numeric keypad, you can call up the program or setup that relates to that button. So you have immediate access to any programs or setups with only one button press. This group of 10 is called a Quick Access Bank. You can have up to 255 banks. The name and number of the bank is on the top line. You can use the channel bank buttons to move through the different banks. You can also go directly to a bank by pressing either the plus, minus, or the clear button on the numeric keypad. You can then type in the bank number and hit OK or Enter. If you look through the preset banks, you will see that we have organized them by groups. This is a useful way to use the banks. You can put similar programs in a bank and then quickly audition them to find the one you want. Creating your own bank is simple. Press Edit. The first parameter you see is entry. This is the number on the numeric keypad that you will assign the program or setup to. You can scroll through each entry with the channel bank buttons. The next parameter lets you select a program or setup. Scroll once to the left and we'll choose Setup. Scroll back to the right and you can choose which setup you want for this entry. That's all there is to it. As you can see, there are soft buttons for naming and saving the bank. The procedure is the same as before. Now that we have played some programs and setups, let's take a step back for a moment and look at how the various parts of the 2500 are related. In Kurzweil's terminology, everything that can be named and saved is called an object. We already have seen that a setup is made of one or more programs. But what about other objects? Let's look at the hierarchy of all the objects. The basic unit of a sound is a sample. This can be one of the samples or waveforms in ROM, or a ROM sample you have edited, or a sample you have created yourself or loaded into sample RAM. The K2000 treats ROM and RAM samples the same way. The next level is the key map. A key map is a group of one or more samples assigned across the keyboard, with each sample assigned to a range of keys. The key map then becomes the basis for a layer in a program. All of the programming parameters in a layer will be applied to all of the samples in the key map. Next, we have setups and quick access banks, which we have already shown. Finally, there are several different master objects, such as velocity and pressure maps, intonation tables, and others.